For 20 years, nobody in the county knew why the widow's barn went quiet. Martha Voss lived off County Road 9 with 40 acres and one Jersey cow that gave her milk, cream, and a calf to sell every spring. Then one Thursday in 1984, she loaded that cow onto a stock trailer before dawn and came home with an empty hitch and an envelope of cash. She handed the money to a neighbor's family about to lose their farm at a sheriff's sale, and she never told a soul where it came from. 20 years later, on the worst winter the county had seen in a generation, somebody turned onto her dirt lane to settle a debt that never went to a bank. Martha Voss was 57 the year the barn went quiet. She ran her 40 acres the way her husband had run them before the heart attack took him in 1979. With a wooden gate at the end of a dirt lane, a tractor older than her marriage, and one fawn-colored Jersey cow named Dolly. The cow was not a pet, though the boy next ridge over treated her like one. Dolly was small for a dairy animal, around 800 pounds, with the wide ribs and calm eyes the breed is known for, and she gave the richest milk in the county, because Jerseys run higher on butterfat than the big black and white Holsteins everyone else kept. At her peak, Dolly gave close to 6 gallons a day. Even on grass alone through a dry summer, she held at 2 or 3. Twice a day, Martha walked out with a stool and a bucket, morning and night, and the chores added up to about 2.5 hours every single day. The milking and the feeding and the straining and the cooling. That sounds like a lot, until you realize the cow was the grocery store, the pharmacy, and the savings account rolled into one quiet animal. Martha traded milk and butter at the feed store for what she couldn't grow, and every spring Dolly dropped a calf that paid the property taxes. The hay was the part that wore her down. A cow eats about 2 to 2.5 pounds of hay a day for every 100 pounds she weighs, which worked out to roughly 1 30-pound bale a day for Dolly, and Martha put up near 2 tons every summer to get one animal through a winter. She cut it with the old tractor, raked it by hand, and stacked it herself in a 10-by-10 mow that held just about a year's feed. By November, the mow was full, the gate was painted, and the place looked poor to anyone driving past, which was exactly how Martha wanted it to look. The Brody place sat on the next ridge, sharing a fence line and one snowblower that both families used and neither would admit to owning. Frank Brody was a big man who had borrowed heavily in the 1970s to buy the 80 across the road, and his boy Eli, 12 that summer, used to ride his bike over to hold Dolly's calf because his own father wouldn't let him near the big cattle. Martha never had children, and she never said so. That is why nobody in the county could figure out later what she did next. The 1980s didn't arrive in the county all at once. They rolled in like a slow frost that killed the top of every hill. Through the 1970s, the boom had been loud, with the Secretary of Agriculture telling farmers to plant fence row to fence row and get big or get out, and land values climbing so fast that lenders and farmers alike decided the good years were the new normal. Easy credit turned into a trap when the bottom fell out. The 1979 grain embargo shut off the Soviet market overnight, and interest rates climbed until they hit a record 21.5% in 1981, which broke anybody carrying debt from the boom. By the winter of 1984, the county had the look of a place under siege. The Federal Reserve had put out a report that January, estimating that 1/3 of all American farmers were carrying nearly 2/3 of the nation's farm debt. And around Cedar County, that number didn't feel abstract. It felt like every other driveway. For every 4 farms that went under, one business on the main street closed, and the feed store had a corkboard full of auction notices that nobody wanted to read. The county heard immediately whenever a new one went up, because a foreclosure notice on a gate is not the kind of thing that stays private. Down at the feed store, the men had a running joke about it. The kind of joke that's only funny until it's your gate. Dale Purdy held court by the coffee pot most mornings, and when somebody mentioned the latest notice, he'd shake his head and say the man borrowed too much and the man bought too big. and the rest of the room would nod, because nodding was cheaper than arguing. One of the older farmers, Walt Harmon, liked to say that the bank forecloses on the dream before it forecloses on the land. And nobody laughed at that one. They just drank their coffee. The Brody notice went up on a Tuesday in October, nailed to the post where the lane met the county road. Frank Brody owed the bank on the 80 he had bought to expand. The note got called when the land values sank, and the bank had stacked on the legal fees and the late penalties until the number was bigger than he could raise in 3 weeks. The sheriff's sale was set, the date printed at the bottom of the notice in type you could read from the road. Martha saw Frank Brody walking the fence line at dusk that same week, the boy Eli a half step behind him, and she knew the walk. It was the walk of a man about to lose ground his grandfather had cleared, the same walk her own husband had worn into the porch boards the winter before he died. She went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table with the bank's numbers turning in her head, and she didn't sleep much that night. Somewhere in the dark, the question settled into a shape she could not put down, which was whether 3 weeks was enough time to do anything that mattered. Martha did the math out loud to the kitchen clock because there was nobody else to do it to. The Brodys owed the bank a number she had heard through the fence, and the bank wanted it inside 3 weeks or the sale went forward. She didn't have that kind of money sitting anywhere. The things she could sell would not bring it in time. The tractor was worth something, but it didn't run right, and selling it took longer than 3 weeks. The land was all she had, and a piece of land takes months to sell even in a good year, which 1984 was not. The only thing she owned that would bring real cash, fast, was Dolly. A family Jersey and milk, with a calf at her side, brought good money at the sale barn in those years, because people still wanted a house cow, even when the big dairies were going under. Both animals together would cover what the Brodys owed the bank, with enough left over for the legal fees the bank had piled on top. Martha knew the number the way she knew how much hay was in the mow, by feel and by the weight of it in her hands. She didn't decide it all at once, and she told no one, which is the part that matters. She walked the fence that night after milking, and she stayed on the stool longer than she needed to, her forehead resting against Dolly's warm side, while the barn cats waited for the spray she always let them lick off the bucket. The county, had it known, would have called it a fool's trade, a widow giving up her own food to patch a neighbor's debt she didn't owe a dime on. That is exactly why she didn't tell the county. She didn't eat the butter she made the next morning. She put it in the cellar with the rest and closed the door. A woman who will not eat her own butter is a woman already saying goodbye to something, and the cows know it before the people do. The decision hardened the afternoon Eli Brody rode his bike up the lane to ask if he could hold the new calf. Martha watched him standing at the gate in his too big coat, and she could see that the boy didn't yet know his family was losing the farm, because 12-year-olds don't read foreclosure notices, and their fathers don't tell them. She let him in, she let him sit with the calf, and she didn't say a word about any of it. By the time he rode off down the lane, she had the date picked. The Thursday the sale barn ran its weekly dairy sale, 2 days before the Brody payment was due. She loaded Dolly and the calf onto the old stock trailer before dawn, in the dark so the neighbors wouldn't see a trailer going out empty and coming back the same way. The ramp clanked, the cow stepped up calm the way Jerseys do, and the calf followed its mother because calves always follow their mothers. Martha closed the latch and checked it twice. She pulled out of the yard with the headlights pointing east toward the sale barn and the sun not yet up over the ridge. The sale barn sat east of town where the pavement turned to gravel, and on a Thursday evening it smelled of wet wool and manure and the coffee they kept hot in a stained pot by the office. The auctioneer worked the dairy sale first, because dairy brought the serious buyers early, before the beef men showed up and the ring got loud. Martha stood in the back by the chalkboard with the lot numbers, Dolly already in the holding pen with the little heifer. She didn't bid on anything or talk to anyone, she just waited for her number to come up. When Dolly walked into the ring, the auctioneer didn't have to work hard. A family cow in milk, gentle, with a heifer calf at her side, was exactly what the small buyers were there for, and the bidding moved fast between two men near the front. The gavel came down on a number that was a little better than Martha had figured, and the calf sold separate right after, to a different man, for cash. She collected the settlement sheet at the window, took the envelope and folded it into the inside pocket of her coat without counting it in front of the clerk. She drove home in the dark with an empty trailer behind her. On the long, straight stretch past the creek, she pulled off onto the gravel shoulder and sat with the engine running, and this is the part where it almost came undone. She had the cash in her coat and the seat beside her empty where the bucket used to ride, and for a full minute she was going to turn around, drive back, and buy the cow off the new owner for whatever he asked, because she had just traded her own winter's food for somebody else's land. Her hands were on the wheel, and the truck was running, and the turn was right there. She didn't take it. She put the truck in drive, pulled back onto the road, and went home to a barn that was already colder than it had been that morning, because an empty stall drops a full 10 degrees when there's no animal breathing in it. The next morning she took the envelope to the bank before it opened, and she paid the sum against the Brody note in cash, bill by bill, at the teller's window. She told the loan officer the money was from the Brody's family, come in from a relative out west, and she asked him not to put her name on anything. The loan officer looked at her, looked at the cash, and didn't ask the question a smarter man would have asked. The sheriff's sale came off the calendar that afternoon. Frank Brody called her that evening, confused, to say a payment had come in from somewhere and the bank had called the sale off. Martha told him the county looks out for its own. Then she asked him about the snowblower, whether he'd swapped the shear pin yet, because that was the subject she wanted to be on. She never told him. She never told anyone. The Brody place stayed in the family because a widow off County Road 9 decided it would, though the county wouldn't know that part for another 20 years. That first winter without the cow was the longest Martha had lived through since the year her husband died, and it was quiet in a way that got into the walls of the house. There was no morning milk, no cream to skim, no butter to trade at the feed store for the feed and the fencing she couldn't make herself. She bought powdered milk in town, the kind that comes in a box, and she didn't tell the clerk why a woman who'd had a Jersey for 30 years was suddenly buying powdered milk. The clerk didn't ask, because people in the county had stopped asking each other things by the mid-1980s. Everybody was too close to the edge of their own trouble. The small costs stacked up the way they do when you lose the thing that used to cover a dozen small gaps. She traded eggs out of her little flock for a pound of butter here and there, and she bartered garden produce in August for the sweet corn and the tomatoes she used to swap cream for. She patched the old tractor herself through the cold that winter, her hands raw on the frozen metal, because there was no calf money to pay anyone to do it. She ate simpler than she had since she was a girl on her father's place, mostly beans and bread and what the garden put up, and she didn't complain about any of it to a single person. Walt Harmon brought her a side of pork one Sunday and wouldn't take anything for it, and Martha sent him home with a jar of green tomato relish because she would not be the one in the county who took without giving back. The neighbors helped her in small, quiet ways that whole winter, none of them knowing they were filling the gap a Jersey cow used to fill, and Martha let them, which was the closest she ever came to admitting what she'd given up. The Brodys came through the winter in one piece, and Frank Brody never did find out where the payment had come from, though he thought about it the rest of his life. The boy Eli started coming over the next summer, 12 going on 13, and he asked Martha if he could put up her hay for her because he'd heard she was doing it alone. She let him, and he came every summer after that, stacking the bales too high in the mow, and he was good at it. He had the build for it even then. Martha paid him in eggs and in suppers, and she never told him why a woman with a mow and a stall and a milk stand didn't just get another cow. One August evening, when the mow was full and the sweat was still drying on both of them, Eli sat on the top bale and asked her straight out why she didn't buy another Jersey. The barn was set up for one, he said, The stanchion was still there, the milk stand was still there. Martha looked at him from the bottom of the mow and said she didn't need one and that she hadn't needed one for a long time. She said it in a voice that should have ended the conversation. The boy nodded and let it go, the way kids do when they sense a door is shut, and he climbed down and rode his bike home. The line hung in the air of the barn for years after that, though neither of them knew it yet, because a thing said plainly in a quiet barn has a way of coming back a long time later. The years did what years do in a county like that one. They folded the 1980s into the 1990s, and the 1990s into the 2000s, without asking anybody's permission. The Brodys kept the 80s. Frank Brody farmed it until his back gave out, and then he farmed it from the seat of the truck until he couldn't do that either. And he passed in the spring of 1996, with the land still in the family name, which was all he'd ever wanted. Eli grew up tall and quiet like his father, left for 2 years to drive truck out of state, and came home in 1999 with a used Kenworth and the idea that he could haul hay and grain and equipment around the county and 2 states over and make a living at it. By 2004, Eli Brody had a small trucking outfit, 5 trucks and a handful of trailers, and a reputation for showing up when the weather was bad and the bigger haulers wouldn't run. He married a girl from the next county, he built a shop on the home 80, and he kept putting up Martha's hay every summer, even after he had men who could have done it for him. Because some debts don't have a receipt, and you pay them in person. He'd bought his first trailer with the money from a winter of hauling round bales out of snowed-in farms, and he'd bought the second the year a big hauler went bankrupt and left a route open. He never forgot that the difference between him and the men who lost their places in the 1980s was a payment that came from nowhere at the right time. He didn't know yet where that payment had come from, but he carried the not knowing the way his father had. Like a stone in his pocket, he turned over and over. Martha aged on her 40 acres the way a post ages in the ground, slowly and without complaint. She never got another cow. She kept the barn clean and the mow half full and the gate painted every spring, and she ran the old tractor into the ground and then ran it some more, fixing it herself with parts she ordered out of a catalog. The county had mostly forgotten the widow off County Road 9 by then, the way a county forgets anyone who doesn't make noise, and that suited Martha fine. The winter of 2004 was the one that broke every record anybody could remember, and the county felt it before Christmas. The cold came down out of the north and stayed. The snow drifted the county road shut twice in January, and by February the hay was running out all over the county because nobody had cut enough to cover a winter this long. The thermometer at the feed store read 19 below one morning, and the man who kept the gauge said he'd never seen it sit there that long without moving. Water lines froze in basements all up and down the county road. The school bus quit running the back routes for a week, and the radio carried nothing but auction notices and requests for hay. Martha's own hay was down to the last dozen bales, the mow nearly empty for the first time since the year she sold the cow, and her few goats and the one old steer she kept for the freezer were down to short rations. She broke ice in the trough at dawn with the back of an axe, her hands so cold she couldn't feel the handle, and she rationed the hay out bale by bale the way a woman counts bullets. The county extension agent came by in the second week of February and tried to put her on an emergency feed list, and Martha told him no. She said she'd been through worse, which wasn't quite true, and she said she'd handle it, which was less true. And she sent him off the lane with a jar of pear butter she'd put up in the fall, because she would not send anyone off her place empty-handed. She would not ask for help. The county knew that about her by then, the way the county knows things, by watching and not by being told. And it was the one thing about Martha Voss that everybody agreed on, that the woman would freeze before she'd ask. By the third week of February, the mow was down to 4 bales, and the steer was standing at the gate looking down the lane like he expected somebody. The trucks arrived before dawn on a Wednesday in the third week of February, and Martha heard the brakes before she saw them. She was already dressed because she slept in her clothes by then. She pulled on her boots on the porch and heard the air brakes hiss a second time, then a third out on the county road. She stepped off the porch into the cold, and when she looked down the lane past the gate, she saw headlights stretched out along the gravel like a convoy, one set after another, far enough back that she couldn't count them in the dark. Eli Brody stepped out of the lead truck with a clipboard and a thermos, and he didn't explain. He just started walking the line and waving the others in. The trucks backed up to the fence, one after another, and the men on them raised the dump beds and rolled the flatbeds down and started unloading. Hay came off the first trucks, small bales and big rounds, then bagged grain off the next, then milk replacer and mineral, and a long trough that two men carried through the gate and set by the water tank. Martha stood on the porch and watched the mow fill, and the cats came out of the barn and sat on the railing, because even a cat knows when the food has arrived. 30 trucks lined the lane by the time the sun came up. The county heard immediately, the way the county always hears, and by mid-morning there were neighbors parked along the road watching a fleet roll onto the widow's lane. The same feed store parking lot that had whispered about the Brodys in 1984, now watching the Brody boy pay a debt the whole county had forgotten. Dale Purdy was there, older now and slower on the steps, and he stood by his truck with his coffee and didn't say a word, which was the first time in 20 years anybody at the feed store had seen Dale Purdy without an opinion. The last truck through the gate carried a bred Jersey heifer in a stock rack, young and fawn-colored and wide in the ribs, and two men walked her down the ramp and into the stall that had been empty for 20 years, and the barn had an animal breathing in it again. Eli came up onto the porch when the unloading was done, and he handed Martha the thermos, and he told her he knew about the cow. He'd found the sale barn settlement sheet in his father's papers the winter after Frank died, the lot number and the date, and the seller listed as M. Voss, and he'd put it together with the winter his family kept the farm, the winter a payment came in from a relative out west who didn't exist. He said he'd spent 20 years looking for a way to pay it back that was big enough, and the hay and the heifer were the closest he'd come. Then he repeated the line she'd given him that August evening in the mow, almost word for word, that she hadn't needed another cow for a long time, and he said it back to her so she could hear how it sounded now, which was nothing like how it had sounded then. Martha didn't say much, because Martha never said much. She took the thermos and she poured 2 cups and she handed one back to him, and they stood on the porch and watched the last truck back out of the lane and turn onto the county road. After a while, she said that the things you give away and don't talk about are the only things that come back with interest, and that most people confuse a debt with a favor. A favor you can pay back with a thank you, but a debt like that one you pay back in hay. It was the one time anyone in the county heard her say what she believed about any of it, and she said it only because the story had already proved it for her. The convoy gone and the mow full, Martha watched the sun come up over the gate she'd painted for 30 years. A debt like that one never went to a bank and never charged interest, and it came due in 30 trucks on the worst winter. If you want the next one from the back roads, subscribe, because the county's still full of stories the papers never printed.